So my name's Debbie Chalice. I work at LSE Library, and I'm interviewing Angela today. Angela, could you just introduce yourself and what you do?
Hi everyone, I'm a museum researcher. I'm actually from Paris and I work on projects around communities and bodies and health.
So you actually work with what's called mummies, like human remains from ancient Egypt, quite a lot, don't you?
Cool. Yeah, so my background is as an Egyptologist and I've been working for 10 years on human remains and especially Egyptian mummies. And it's actually this research on bodies that's really inspired my other projects looking at our own bodies.
So, so you have worked on a museum around a certain kind of disease, which you have. Could you just explain what that disease is and you know how it makes people feel?
Yeah, so it's called Lyme disease, and it's an illness that is caused by bacteria that are carried by ticks. And if you have Lyme disease and it's diagnosed early and treated, then most patients recover. But unfortunately, if you're not diagnosed because someone misses it, or if you're not treated properly at the beginning, then it can become a chronic illness. And it can really impact your health and have long-term problems, but also really reduce your quality of life.
And a tick is a kind of insect, isn't it? That you can get it on horses and wildlife.
The tick is a small crawling insect. It's very tiny, so it's really easy to miss it. And it usually is in grass areas and forest, and it really likes hanging around deers.
Okay. So how is this disease, this illness, unseen?
Well, first, it's really difficult to find Lyme disease on medical tests, and a lot of countries don't agree on which tests are the most reliable, which means it's really easy to miss it. But also, it mimics other illnesses. So things like fibromyalgia, Crohn's disease, or chronic migraines are very similar. So it's really hard to know who has Lyme disease. But it also affects lots of parts of your bodies. And so it's really sort of difficult to see it. That's why it's an invisible illness. So it can affect your brain and make you really tired or give you insomnia. It can affect your stomach or your joints and give you really bad general pain.
So it's basically can cause chronic disabilities, but you can't always be aware that somebody's got them. Are there any other disabilities that are unseen that you could compare it to?
Yeah, I think that it's very similar to other illnesses that you might not know, like people who have chronic migraine that will feel really bad, but you actually can't see it, or people that suffer from Crohn's disease and have their stomach really affected, but they're not things that you can actually see when you meet a person in the street. That's why you always have to assume that you don't know the person's medical history and what they're going through. But that's also why there are really good systems in place, like those sunflower lanyards that you can find in places like the airport or even your supermarket. And they're really here to give a signal to people and say, well, actually, I need a bit more help. And you can't see it, but I'm giving you a signal. That's something I use, for example, and it's really effective in letting you know that the person next to you maybe needs to, skip the queue, or maybe they need help with carrying things.
That's really interesting. So thinking about that and how you see the unseen, particularly like in the body and that kind of thing, what gave you the idea of this exhibition? Now it's part of a bigger museum, so maybe if you could just say a word about the museum and then explain the exhibition.
So the Lyme Museum is a museum I created, and the idea comes from my background as a museum researcher and also someone who lives with Lyme disease. And last year I worked in a medical collection, and I was really interested in the displays and how museums, they don't necessarily represent people with invisible illnesses specifically because it's invisible. So I really wanted to give people that have invisible illnesses and disabilities a voice, and give them, a platform online where they could share their stories. So that's why I created the Lyme Museum, to really, represent this invisible illness or disability and give people a voice, making, the invisible visible.